Welcome, audience. If you want to turn on your videos, please do so, and please mute. We're going to wait about 3 or 4 minutes for more people to show up. There's also a severe thunderstorm in the New York area, and it's possible that people here may have lost their routers. So, and we just lost one visit.
This is the storm that dumped a bunch of rain on Indianapolis this morning. So it's and there wasn't thunder and lightning, but there was a lot of rain.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the Yankees.
So Michael and Eleanor, do you want to turn your video on? You don't have to participate. Of course, Dr. Lee and I are going to be doing all the talking, but we just lost one of our people. Perhaps it's a question of saying we're in the wrong room. Here's my first classmate, other than the speakers, to show up. Our students show up in sort of in the last 45 seconds and then up to 3 minutes after. So we are getting some classmates have found the way. Please feel free to turn on your videos. This way I can tell if Kai and I are going to keep you awake. Gerland, we could have a trumpet blast if you wish.
He's trying to connect. He's not there yet.
But wait a minute, Gaby, if you're here, how could he not be?
Because he's got his own computer, so he's heading over there, but it's taking him a little bit of time.
Well, you can listen on your computer as well, you know.
That's
There
true.
you
That's
go.
why I set it up, but
And
I see the video's not working. I don't know why. We had this issue
Oh.
last night also.
And then I'm now here with Gaby,
Mhm.
but apparently you have to go in through Chrome, and it didn't work with the regular Columbia link. A number of people had the same problem, I understand, but
Then we'll give them some time. Now, AV, are we having problems with people logging on? Do we know about? Is there an alternative we can provide? Because most people were given a URL that should resolve to this room.
Yes, that URL seems, I am not having any issues with it, but let me try it out on my end again.
Okay.
well, I'm going to go to my other computer.
See if you can get on there. Go ahead.
It's Gaby we really want, and we just put up with Gerland.
There you go.
We have Neil's video, we have Michael's video.
Where's Linda? I thought she was coming. Neil, where's Linda? She was coming because she liked it so much last time. You said last night.
Yes, he seemed to remember from 5 years ago.
See that? You were very popular.
Kai and I, before you got here, were discussing the number of horses that there should be in a stable before you start taking out the oats. It isn't quite what we said, but that's close enough. There is the concept of a minion, of course. There are only 8 of us at the moment, but I think that Gaby and Robert count as 2, so that makes 9. And if Linda shows up, we actually do have that 10. Although we have 2 Michael Stephens.
My main memory is that a minion has a more precise and narrow definition, which some of us do not fit.
It's true.
Well, that does not apply. There was a little tiny synagogue across the street from where I lived in the Bronx, and the rabbi was always grabbing people. The Catholic kids in the neighborhood would say, but Rabbi, I'm not Jewish. And the rabbi would look at them and say, are you sure you're not Jewish? And so on, because he felt you could put them in the minyan first and then, resolve the question later. So you have no problem logging on through your other device, right? I just see you appeared twice. Whoops, and now she disappeared once. I see one of them is Columbia, yes. So you're now on both devices.
Yes, I just wanted to test things out from the other side. It seems like the link is doing okay, but I will drop something into the chat box here now. If you have any friends or that are still trying to enter, you can share this link with them if you like.
Great. Does anyone know? Because let's see. Bob Gerland said that he had was told that other people had problems. He's beginning to log on as himself. Anyway, I don't want to delay the start for more than a minute or two, because we have all sorts of fun things, and it will be an interesting exercise for the people who come in late.
And Dan, if things are churning along at 9 o'clock, I will be happy to yield the gentleman from New York some minutes.
Yeah, no, I can talk fast if necessary. Although my medical students, some of them show up in person, and many of them listen to the tape that we make of all lectures, and they play it back at double speed. I once began one lecture by talking very fast about this. I'd like to talk today about the neuromuscular junction, and the neuromuscular junction is essential for the and so on. And then when they played that back at double speed, of course, it was quite difficult to hear. Here comes Dee from the engineering school, Kyle. So we are getting people coming on. So I'm willing to delay another minute or two. Welcome all of you who are here. Please feel free to put on your videos. Dee, you are twice here. I see you in one window, and then there's another window which seems to have the audio from another device. And we're just waiting because some people have had problems logging on. Otherwise, I would be in, as they say, full flower. Not only that, but both the New York Mets and the New York Yankees have canceled their games tonight so that they could attend this or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what the arrow of causality shows. So it says 8:09. I'm going to start kicking things off at 8:10. Okay, because we have a good audience. And I don't want to withhold any of this, the fun of this, from people. And let's see, that's the chat is, okay, so that's for you to send to people. In the chat, there's a direct link in case anyone is frantically calling your cell phone and saying, I can't get in. Okay, enough delay. It's 10 minutes after 8. Welcome all to Science for Poets. Since this is the class of 1966, it's definitely aging poets. So I'm here, I'm Dan, and I'm with our classmate Kylie, and we're going to give you some interesting and important and fun insights that weren't known 55 years ago when we graduated. I'll discuss our brains, and Kai is going to talk about our planet. Michael Garrett says he can hear, but I'm broken up. Now, I think this may be a problem because of all of the lightning in Brooklyn. What about the rest of you? Robert, can you hear properly?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Michael, it's probably something local to where you are. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about our brains, and Kai is going to be talking about our planet. And I hope Michael's sound improves, but we're going to begin. So I'm going to include some amazing things that we know about the brain. And I'm going to stress the fact that what we don't know about the brain is even more amazing. As it says here on this slide, I'm at Cornell's Weill Medical College, but I wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for my years at Columbia. So what am I going to tell you in less than the next hour? This is what, okay? I'm going to tell you about your brain. What we're going to do is we're going to start by admiring the underlying principles. Then we're going to see how evolution has used those principles to make neurons, which are cells, and then how neurons working together make our brains. And it's always a good idea to start with the principles. Okay, but what are the principles? We begin on the very first page of Principles of Neuroscience. This is the brand new 6th edition of this book. So we call it royally Principles the 6th. It is a Columbia book. Columbia is its intellectual home. And here is the very first sentence. Okay, that's with the last frontier, the ultimate challenge, the most amazing thing about the brain, and one we don't yet understand, and that is how our brain enables us to know who we are and to feel, to act, to learn, and to remember. I'm going to get to all of these. The book offers exhaustive sets of, from its name, principles. And if you want to dive deeply into these, read the book. You can see it behind my right shoulder, but here it is, a close-up on my bookshelf. It's 1,639 pages long. It weighs 9 pounds. With most books, the complimentary thing to say is, I couldn't put it down. With Principles the 6th, we say, I couldn't pick it up. And I can't tell you to buy it. It's a conflict of interest. My wife has 3 chapters in it, and I have 1. And for every copy sold, we get 24.7 cents. Conflict of interest. But this book is a big deal. It is today's Columbia book, the way these fondly remembered books, also on my bookshelf, were almost 60 years ago. But I promise to give you some principles, and I'm going to make them simple as I can, and not exhaustive. We need just 3 principles. Physics rules, math reveals, evolution tempers diversity with stability, and I'm going to make these simple. First, the physics. Okay, oil and water don't mix. Opposite charges attract. Things move and bump into one another. Doing something useful requires energy, and there's no free lunch. Okay, that's the physics. Next, the math. Now, why math? Eugene Wigner wrote a piece entitled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. And in it, he said, it is difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here. The miracle is that equations describe the real world, but I won't show any, or maybe I'll show one. Here it is, just for a moment. Because as I said on this page where I presented the equation, this equation started a scientific revolution. When I start talking about sparks in 5 minutes or so, this is the equation for a spark. Now, the relevant equations are 2 kinds. They're differential equations and statistics. And what these 2 types of equations that I won't show say is simple. The diffees say that things usually follow a simple, sometimes graceful or elegant path in time or in space or both. And this equation is one of those. The equations of probability and statistics say sometimes yes, sometimes no. And here's an example. Every piece of stuff floating in a soup, and I'm going to be talking about soups, is like a leaf blowing in the breeze. It's likely that the leaf will go the way the wind is blowing, but it isn't certain. Similarly, it's likely that something floating in a soup will go somewhere and do something a particular way, but nothing is certain. And describing and predicting these Possibilities and near certainties is what statistics does. Okay, what about evolution? We all know Newton's remark about standing on the shoulders of giants. I haven't gone as far as Newton, and that may be because I only leaned on the shoulder of Charles Darwin as captured here. But evolution through natural selection writes the book of life, the book of successful life. The book is in every one of our cells, and we're going to make our first cell in a minute or two. And it has instructions to make a cell and a whole body, and to read and copy and proofread itself. Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was here at Columbia, said famously, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And that principle is important enough to be etched in stone on the floor of Notre Dame. It's the university in South Bend rather than the cathedral in Paris, but it's a principle. Okay, so those are the principles. What have I told you about them? You only have to remember these, that physics rules, that math reveals, that evolution tempers diversity with stability. And as promised, they're pretty simple and they underlie everything. So now on to neurons. That's the next section. We need to build and to understand neurons before we get to brains. The brain is what it is because it brings together and puts to work 80 some odd billion neurons. So we're going to see first why neurons are amazing. What are neurons? Okay, it says here up at the top, neurons are cells in the brain. But what's a cell? Let's make a cell. Here's the recipe: oil and water and salts. Salts and other stuff float in water, forming a soup. Other things float in the oil, and oil and water don't mix. Are we okay so far? To make a cell, oil wraps all the way around a bit of the watery soup. The oil makes a boundary, a border separating the soup inside from the soup outside. And look, we made a cell. That oil is called a cell membrane, and it's not just any oil, it's very particular oils. We call them membrane lipids. And the cell we just made, like all cells, floats in a salty soup, a salty ocean. Now the soup inside the cell is separate from the soup outside. They're isolated by that oily lipid membrane. And that means that the salts in the soups inside and the soups outside can be different, and they are. Also, inside the cell are other smaller bags of watery soup surrounded by oil, lots of them with really neat names: nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi, vesicles. It's the nucleus, of course, that contains the cells or the neurons' DNA. The vesicles carry special soupy messages, and they're important for the brain to work, and we're going to get to them later. Now we add proteins to our recipe for a cell. What are proteins? Proteins are big molecules. Each of them is a long, long chain of atoms. The chains of atoms fold into tiny machines. So proteins are also machines that do things. Some proteins like water, they float in the soup. They like to work with other proteins. Some proteins like both oil and water, and they sit in the membrane and they poke into the inside soup and also into the outside soup. And they're called membrane proteins, and they control which stuff moves across the membrane. Now, everything I've said here applies to cells in general, but we're interested in neurons because they make up our brains, and neurons are amazing because they're really very special cells. How are they special? Most cells in the body just sit there and do their own thing, moving stuff around or dissecting it or chemical things. Most of them are round, some of them are a little bit elongated, and the main part of the cell, the little round thing, the cell body, does the work of the cell. But neurons are different, and what they do is special. What is it and how do they do it? They communicate. They talk to one another. And they also listen to other neurons. What do they hear? What do they say? It's information. What's information? Information is anything that reduces uncertainty. That's what neurons specialize in. If you've ever felt uncertain, your neurons were working to reduce the uncertainty. How do they do this? They gather information, they process information, and they pass on the information. Your neurons carry information from your past, and they listen to what's happening in the present, and they help you understand that present and plan for the future. So how do they do this? Like other cells, neurons are electrical and neurons are chemical. And they send messages using electricity, that's sparks, and chemistry, that's soups. How do they do this? There are salts in our soups. When salts float in the water, they dissolve into atoms, and the atoms are electrical, they have charges. Sodium and potassium and calcium have positive charges. Chloride has negative charges. Like charges repel, unlike charges attract, and that's one of our physics principles. Atoms or molecules with charges are called ions, and the salts and ions in the soup inside the cell are different from the salts and ions outside the cell. Cells are clever. Evolution makes use of this difference to make cells little batteries and generate only about 1/20th of a volt, which we call 50 millivolts. Like any battery, there's a plus and a minus. The inside of the cell is the minus, and the outside of the cell is positive. And it takes only a tiny number of charges to generate that 1/20th of a volt. So cells are very thrifty and very efficient. And what's really neat is that cells can flip their battery. So the inside is 50 millivolts positive. Wow, you can reverse the battery and it still works like this. Once you can do this flip, naturally you would want to sit there for a while and admire what you've done to have it persist. No. And that's one of the great things that evolution figured out, to make the reversing of the battery and back again much faster than the blink of an eye. Normal negative inside, then positive inside, then back to negative. Let's call it a spark. And the cell can generate and launch 200 sparks every second. And the spark can travel along the entire neuron membrane, because neurons aren't just this round cell shown here. Some neurons have long extended parts that extend up to 1 meter long, and the spark can travel the entire meter. How do they do this? Neurons do all of this using those proteins that float in the oily lipid membrane. Now, the proper name for this spark is an action potential or a spike. And the principle here is that neurons use sparks, action potentials, to send messages to all different parts of the same neuron, even if they're 1 meter away. I can't resist showing this. This is the first spark ever recorded from inside a neuron. Time is on the horizontal axis and voltage is on the vertical. And the cells, the neurons, battery, goes from about minus 50 millivolts up to about plus 50 millivolts and back, and it does it in less than a millisecond. And the sparks are messages. They carry information. There's a language of sparks. It's a very strange language because it has only one letter, that's it. And we're going to see how that works when we get to brains in a couple of minutes. Okay, that's sparks. Now to soups. How do cells listen to other cells and talk to still others? They use soups, tiny soup dumplings, to send messages to one another. And why soups? Well, because two neurons can get very close to one another, but they can't quite touch. Their membranes can't quite touch one another. It's like social distancing. So sparks can't bridge the gap from one cell to the next. Instead, what happens is that one neuron pops a soup dumpling, and the sour, tasty soup inside, called neurotransmitter molecules, they float into the soup between the cells, and the other cell tastes them, and then thereby the message is passed. Why is it tasty? The most popular neurotransmitter is glutamate, like MSG. Why is it sour? Because acids help get the glutamate into the soup dumpling. But these soup dumplings don't carry nutrition, they carry information. And the place where the soup dumpling carries information from one cell to another is called, and it says here, a synapse. Now, for something really profound that evolution worked out, and that is essential for all our brains to do the amazing things they do. It's called inhibition. Most of the time, the soup dumpling message one neuron sends to another will excite it, make more likely that that second cell will generate a spark. But sometimes it's the reverse. It tells the second cell not to get too excited. And so soup dumplings come in two flavors. The excitatory ones contain glutamate, but the inhibitory ones contain different but similar amino acids called glycine or GABA. And neurons are specialists. They either excite, releasing glutamate on all the neurons they make synapses with, or they inhibit, releasing those other amino acids. So those are the principles of neurons. Now for about 2 minutes of details, just 3 details, and then it's on to the brain. First detail. Neurons go places and do things. Neurons have cell bodies, just like usual cells, and it does the usual thing, but the work that makes the neuron special is done by the special parts, the extended parts of the neuron, and the special membrane proteins in those extended parts. Some of the extended parts are like antennas. They receive messages, and they're called dendrites because they look like the branches of a tree because they're antennas that get messages from many, many other cells. Other extended parts of the neuron carry messages from the neuron to other neurons. And these are like cables, these output parts, and they're called axons. Some of them are only a millimeter or so for a cell that only sends messages to other cells right near it, but some of them are a meter or more long. And the dendrites and the axons each have a whole special repertoire of membrane proteins, all designed to receive or to pass on sparks or soup dumpling messages. Now here are 3 neurons, each of which has dendrites and axons. So which other neurons does a particular neuron talk to, form synapses with? Well, it's very particular, not just any neuron. Each neuron has its own individual telephone book or address book. The one on the left may listen to just a couple of hundred other neurons. The one in the middle might listen to a couple of thousand. And the one on the right with that extensive dendritic tree listens to more than 100,000 other neurons. So the dendrites are very particular and very selective antennas listening for just the right information from the right neurons. So using sparks and soups and soups and sparks, neurons get info, do something with it, and pass it on. And this makes circuits, and circuits will make a brain. Now, some neurons are curious because they get information not from other neurons, but from the outside world or other parts of the body. And these, as it says here, are called sensory neurons, and they have special membrane proteins that let them know what's happening in the world outside. Some neurons are assertive. They're called motor neurons, and they send their axons not to other neurons, but to muscles. They talk to the muscles and tell them when to pull and when not to pull. And muscles have special proteins that can pull on things and exert force. So is a neuron just like a relay, just automatically passing on messages? No. The second amazing detail is that once neurons pass a message, they're changed by it. They remember it, so that the subsequent messages they exchange are stronger or weaker dependent. This is called sensory plasticity, and it is the simplest, indeed, it is the basic form of memory. How long does the trace, the change, the memory last? Sometimes at some synapses, only a few seconds, but sometimes forever, for a lifetime. And this plasticity is the basis of our memory. We remember because our brain remembers, and our brain remembers because our synapses remember. That's it. Third detail. Neurons are special cells in another way. They live forever, well, almost forever. Most boring cells are born, they do their things, die, and they're replaced by others. Skin cells, liver cells, even bone cells, like a couple of weeks later or something, over and over again, as long as we live. But most neurons live as long as we do. Once they're born and they're in place, they stay there. Why are they special in this way? So they can record experience, so they can make long-lasting networks with other cells? We don't know. Hey, that is the first time I've said we don't know, but there are going to be a lot more times, because now we're going to move on to the brain. And just before we move on, let's see what I told you about neurons that you need to remember, okay? Neurons are cells made of oil and water and salts and membranes and proteins, but they're special cells because they can process information using sparks, more, because they can talk to one another using those soup dumplings. And when they talk, some excite, some inhibit. Neurons can also remember the past and tune themselves to prepare for the future. That's synaptic plasticity. And they live a long time. Okay, when we take 86 billion neurons and put them together in just the right way, we get a brain. On to brains. It is instructive to compare your brain to a fly. Yours is bigger, more than 1 million cubic millimeters, and a fly brain fits into only 1 cubic millimeter. I don't know if you can see it. It's really tiny there. That's the fly brain on the same scale. It's a little hard to see. It's only a dot. So we're going to expand it way out of actual proportion. It still fits into less than a cubic millimeter, but at least by blowing it up here, we can see it. And we can see a lot of little colored dots that are actually individual neurons in that part of the fly brain that's been worked out. Our brains and the fly brains work the same way. Both have neurons, both have synapses. Fly neurons are pretty small, but they do the job. I mean, a fly can, well, it can fly, and it can do all the other things an organism needs to do. It can walk 6 legs. It can see, smell, feel, taste. Most importantly, it can learn. A fly can learn. And it learns the same way we do, using synaptic plasticity. And it does this with only maybe 100,000 neurons in its tiny brain. Even more amazing, before a fly is a fly, it's a fly larva. And a fly larva has only a few thousand neurons, but it too can learn, and it can plan for the future using synaptic plasticity. It's not just a fly, it's a larva, for goodness sake, and it even has special teaching neurons. So it might be reassuring to know that your brain has more neurons than the brain of a fly or a snail or a cat. Before we can use our brains, these 86 billion neurons have to be wired together and then tuned. And amazingly, the tuning means taking lots of perfectly good neurons and synapses and discarding them until what's left works just the right way for us to cope with the world and to learn in response to what's around us. On to principles. I'm going to offer 3 sets of principles that enable our amazing brains: how we sense things, how we learn and remember, and how we become conscious of ourselves and of our surroundings. And as promised, the most amazing things are going to be the ones that we don't know. Principles of sensation. This is really important but aren't you just a bit tired of 25 minutes of PowerPoint bulleted lists? I am. So here's exactly the same beautiful material taken straight from the pages of Principles the Sixth. Beautiful. Our senses enlighten and empower us. Through sensation, we form an immediate and relevant picture of the world and our place in it, informed by our past experience and preparing us for probable futures. Sensation provides immediate answers to three ongoing questions, essential questions. Is something there? What is it? And what's changed? To answer these questions, all sensory systems perform two fundamental functions: detection and discrimination. I couldn't have said it better myself. Esther, who's sitting in the corner, couldn't have said it better herself. But how? How do we know what we see, hear, feel, smell, taste? There are two answers. One of them is easy and one of them is very hard. The easy one is those curious neurons I talked about with sensory receptors. They carry information along their axons, and their messages get filtered, shaped, and directed to specific parts of the brain. The hard one: the brain takes the messages apart and it shapes them, and from this we construct a percept of this world. But how? And on the way to the brain, the sensory neurons carry their messages only as sparks. Remember I said that sparks are the only way that neurons have of sending messages down their axons to trigger the release of those soup dumpling neurotransmitters. So the brain has its own language for communication, but the language has only one letter. How do you compose a message if you only have one letter to spell it with? Isn't that limiting? No, here's a thought experiment. Every sensation you've ever experienced, everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, everything you've smelled, every touch you've ever felt, any sensation from within your body entered your brain, and so your consciousness, only as a set or train of sparks along a neuron, one letter language. And there also are some sparks in the lower right of the figure, lots of sparks, each shown as a short vertical line on the 24 or so horizontal lines that are shown as when a spark occurs with respect to time. Information is conveyed, and only conveyed, by which neuron the spark is in, when it is generated, and then in patterns of spark after spark, in the same neuron or in different neurons. And we will see that from that, the brain emerges. Now, this applies to all our senses, but I'm going to focus on how we see. You know that our eye forms an image on the retina, which is part of the brain, but the brain never sees that image. In the retina, there are special cells called rods and cones, you know that, and they have membrane proteins that trap photons of light, and when they trap the photon, they twist a bit. This causes some other proteins and soups to do things, and this changes the number of soup dumpling vesicles released. That's a signal that there is light. Other cells receive and tune this information and get it ready to be sent to the brain along only 1 million or 2 long axons called the optic nerves connecting the eyes to the brain. But the information does not include the picture of what we see. To get the maximum amount of information in real time about the visual world, the eye and the brain are constantly playing 20 questions. 20 different types of neurons send axons to the brain, and each provides a filtered view, a particular kind of information about the visual scene. These include brightness, core, edges, directions, movements, and more. That's what goes to the brain, and it spreads out within the brain. Okay, from the core, from Humanities A, here are Virgil and Dante, and they're visiting a brain science lab. Okay, Virgil is in green with the olive wreath, and Dante is in red. The lab happens to be at Columbia in the new Manhattanville campus. And here are 3 views of the 20 or so that the eye sends to the brain. The one on the upper left just sends color information. The one on the upper right just shows contrast over large, coarse areas. The lower left one just sends information about edges. What the eye does not send to the brain is the complete view on the lower right. That's not one of the 20 ways the eye looks at the world and tells the brain about it. So what does the brain do with these 20 ways of looking at the world? It splits them up more. It sends them to 100 or more different areas of the brain, each dedicated to some particular aspect of how we see. Some areas care about what we see to recognize things. Others care about where things are so we can find them or avoid them. Still others specialize in form, color, arcs, motion, location. Some see only faces, not other things. And let's go to such a special brain area. We hear when a neuron in this area fires sparks. And what is the neuron in this area looking at? We'll see the images. It only fires when it sees faces, and not to all faces. It's only a particular face, even when seen from different angles. How do we really know that this neuron and others like it actually help us see faces, that they're doing something? We can temporarily disrupt them, doesn't hurt them, and they go back to doing their thing. And I have to thank the patient and the doctor who made it possible for me to show this.
1, 2.
We're disrupting those neurons, and the
You just turned
vision
into somebody else.
of faces
Your
Your
changes.
face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy, went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. Trip.
Did I keep my gender?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
How did you know I'm not a female?
Because you're still wearing a suit and tie.
Oh, you could see the suit and tie.
Yeah. Only your face changed. Everything else was the same.
I told you this would be amazing. That's the result of temporarily stimulating that area of the brain where those face neurons are. So in the brain are many pictures of everything you're seeing at this moment. And all the pictures are different, and none of them corresponds to what you experience when you open your eyes. What we don't know is how these many different parts with their many different views contribute to the whole that we perceive. How do the different views come together? We don't know. And because it's such an important question, it has its own name, the binding problem. Maybe the sparks, the action potentials in many areas are all somehow synchronized with one another. We don't know. Okay, that's one amazing thing. Now on to memory and learning. You must remember this. Why do we remember? What is memory? Memory takes our sensations and our immediate experience and makes them persist so we can recall them. And learning is how we use memory to change how we respond as our world changes with time. Without memory and learning, as it says here, we can remember nothing. Our past tense is lost. We can live only in the now, in the immediate present tense, and therefore we have no experience to guide either our present actions or our planning for the future. And these are inextricably linked with our ideation of self and surround, of consciousness, of causality and anticipation. Because without learning, we're helpless in the world, buffeted, unable to respond to stimuli or to shape our environment. Without memory, we are not ourselves. We are only a fleeting shadow with a transient existence in a bewildering present. And this, of course, is one of those amazing things that the brain does, because learning gives us information. Learning reduces our uncertainty, and the memory stores this information, gives it persistence. How long does it last? Well, again, it varies. Our short-term memory lasts seconds, maybe a minute or two. It bridges our past and our future, and so enables us to live in the present. And long-term memory can last days or weeks or a lifetime. And I already told you how it is that we remember. It's by changing the strength of soup messages passed from one neuron to another, synaptic plasticity. And of course, this applies to the brain, which is where these neurons are. So we learn and remember because our synapses do. And we remember different things in different ways in different parts of the brain. Now, short-term memory and long-term memory are different, as I just told you, but there are other important differences, different kinds of memory as well. Let me explain what they are by introducing H.M. You may have heard of him, he's famous. His name was Henry Mollison. He is famous because when he was a young man, he had epilepsy. And to relieve it, a neurosurgeon removed the affected parts of the brain, the hippocampus and some nearby parts of the left side of H.M.'s brain. Now, so as not to leave any areas in the brain that might be generating epilepsies, he also removed the hippocampus on the other side of H.M.'s brain as well. When Henry awoke from the surgery, he was no longer capable of laying down any new long-term memory. Memories of the past were intact, and he could hold short-term memories in his brain for a few minutes, but that was it. Every morning, the people who took care of him had to introduce themselves anew because H.M. could not remember what had happened the previous day. So H.M. does confirm that there are two kinds of memory, short-term and long-term, and that the hippocampus, which was taken out, is needed to convert short-term to long-term memories. But there's more, because he drew a star. He was asked to, it's a test. Given this gray star you can see up here, which has two outlines with a little space between it, H.M. was asked to draw between the two without going outside the lines, and not even looking at it directly while looking at his hand in the mirror. This isn't easy. And like anyone else, H.M. first did this in a pretty wobbly way, but with practice, he learned to do better, just as any of us would. And this first graph here on the left shows his performance on the first day. The errors go down from the first trial to the 10th. Pretty good, that's learning. The next day, H.M. was asked to do it again. Now, he didn't remember from the previous day, of course, so the rules had to be explained to him all over again. But look, the middle graph, he had learned because his hand remembered how to do it, even if he didn't. And he started out making fewer errors. And this was repeated a third day. And look, he was nearly perfect. And of course, on the third day, he didn't remember he'd done it on the day before or the day before that. And Henry looked at the really good job he did on the third day and said, boy, I thought this would be really hard, but it's easy. Because the part of his brain that remembered ideas and experiences was missing, and so couldn't and didn't remember he'd done it before. But the different part of his brain that learns movements and skills was intact, and it did remember. So he confirmed for us that the brain remembers how to do things and then how to think and talk about them in different ways and in different parts of the brain. So H.M. not only drew a star, but he was a star of brain science. Okay, is everybody awake? Everybody aware? Does everybody know who they are, where they are? Could you remember this 5 minutes later and tell it to me? If so, you're probably conscious. What does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to be aware, to know that you are you and that you're a part of the world which is outside you? And of course, or your knowledge of the world outside you is actually within you, in your brain. Where in your brain? Well, we know which parts of the brain participate in this, because if they're damaged or shut down, we're no longer aware. We lose consciousness. Here are those parts of the brain that, if damaged, cause us to lose consciousness. What we see in green and red are neurons. They actually represent many neurons that form a circuit by interconnecting special brain areas in special ways. My Weill Cornell colleague, Dr. Nico Schiff, has identified those parts of our brains that give us this essential understanding that we are we. Some of these neurons involved are shown here in these little red and green lines, and they link some special parts of the brain. And when the network they form is intact and undamaged, we're conscious. When it's disrupted, we lose consciousness. Now, there are people who are minimally conscious due to trauma, stroke, or other disorder, infection, and there are others who have no consciousness. They're in a persistent vegetative state. And shown in the blue arrows here, so you see the blue arrows are treatments that have been tried that may help some individuals, but not all, who have lost consciousness, and that my colleague Nico and others across the globe are trying out. We know we are conscious, but what about animals? Who's conscious? Is a cat conscious, a dog, a mouse, a duck, a fly? All of those almost certainly. Maybe not the fly, I don't know. Also, if cells, soups, and sparks are how the brain works, and we're sure that they are, how do they create consciousness? We don't know. Nobody knows. So if other animals are conscious, what makes us special? We think we're special, but those other creatures' neurons use the same kinds of sparks and soups and so on as the ones that we have. We do have some special nerve cells that don't look exactly like those found in any other animal, but come to think of it, so do flies and so do fish. Is it the number of neurons we have? Maybe. We do have more neurons, so maybe we're like a modern advanced computer chip compared to other creatures that have the kind of chips that computers had 25 years ago. We don't know. Our neurons are smaller, and so we get more neurons into the brains. Is that the difference? Maybe. We don't know. Nobody knows. So we're getting closer to the end, and it's time to clarify what we know and what we don't. We know lots about the parts that make up the brains, the neurons, the sparks, and the soups. We've seen 3 quick looks at some of the things our brains do. But what we lack is what we might call the owner's manual. And that might tell us how those parts work together to make the brain do those amazing things. And of course, because things continue to go wrong with our brains, what we also need is the service manual to tell us how we can fix the damaged brain. So what do we have to remember about the brain? Brains do things because their neurons do. They let us experience the world and ourselves. We learn because our brains learn. Our brains know who we are and that we exist. And we do know some things about how the brains work, but as I promised you, what we don't yet know is even more amazing. Now, this talk has been the first of 2 called Science for Poets, and I want to end with a poem for science. It didn't start out as a poem. I was down at the NIH a couple of years ago listening to a talk by Pat Churchland, who is our leading philosopher of neuroscience. And I was teasing her about some of the dubious arguments she was willing to entertain. And I thought afterwards I would just send her an email with what I really believed and what we could both agree on. And it came out like this. I said, this I believe, the brain is constrained by the laws of physics and evolutionarily successful paths to respond and adapt to information delivered through neurons from the body and the universe in which it finds itself. And with the line breaks there, as I thought of each idea, it looked kind of poetic. And Pat thought so too, because she immediately replied by email and thanked me for my poem with this, and she said she loves it as a poem. So I decided to keep it as a poem. Okay, I'm done. Here's my acknowledgement slide. It's a selection of teachers whose teaching I relied on or who inspired my attempt at teaching to you today. And since this is an alumni event, I thought I would list all the colleges and years that they were alumni of. I'm done. Questions?
Dan, I thought that was literally a mind-bending talk. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. You've set a very high bar. I'd like, however, to press you on two matters. The simpler one is about how memory works, especially long-term memory. Does that mean that the synapses involved in long-term memory continue to fire for all of our lives?
No, they don't have to fire. What it means is that when a spark comes along and it is necessary for them to send information to another cell, they, for long-term memories, they have been designed so that they, as a function of learning, release more soup vesicles per spark, and the other neuron has more molecules, membrane proteins that taste it, so that the message is stronger in the other cell. But it's not, and this is an interesting point, because years ago, they thought it might be what you thought about, which is reverberation, in which a signal would keep going in a circle forever. And people couldn't quite understand, well, how would that keep up for 30 years? And then you remember something suddenly from back then. And has that been reverberating all this time?
Right.
No, the synapse is designed so that when you are ready to use it, the message will be stronger. And that means that the circuits formed by one neuron connecting to another and to another, those are stronger circuits. And those are the ones that make things easier to remember.
Okay, but unlike the difference between a RAM and a hard drive in a computer, there's not a simple kind of structural difference between memory, long-term memory, and short-term memory in that sense. Yes.
But there is a simple structural difference, and it's just a simple. There are more. A normal synapse, say, that has not been potentiated, made stronger, might have a place that can release some soup dumplings in two places, and then there might be 20 or 30 receptors to that particular soup on the other cell. If the synapse is strengthened, then there might be 4 places to release soup dumplings, and there might be 3 times as many receptors. It seems appallingly simple, but this is the case. And it can be shown. You can generate long-term memories, and then you can look at the ultrastructure. And everything that I've told you has been supported by thousands of experiments. I've just made it as simple, trying to get down to the basics. Mm-hmm. It's gratifying, and it's a contrast to the many things we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Dan?
Yes.
You hear me?
Yes.
Mike Stevens?
Yes.
Thank you very much for an incredible presentation. I'm sitting here nostalgically recalling 1963, where after having a very undistinguished first year of chemistry, realized that science was not for me, and I took poet science. And it was, again, an incredible experience. For those of you who aren't poets for science, a senior faculty member taught their specialty, the research specialty. You read the research, you did all of those things. And this is what I can remember. One semester was cellular biology, and it was at a time when I think the initial research on meiosis and mitosis being different kinds of cell division. And I remember meiosis, mitosis. I can't remember which is which, differentiated and undifferentiated. And the second semester was to deal with the way a muscle is, agitated or activated to contract, a combination of chemistry and electronics and everything else. So thank you for a real nostalgic trip. And I can't thank you for how well you presented this topic.
Well, thank you, but it's not over yet. It is now Kai's turn.
Dan, before you go, can I ask a quick question?
I suppose. I wanted to hear Kai.
One comment. I missed the first 20 minutes, for which I apologize, because the link went to a class of 2016 event. So it's possible there would be more people here if that hadn't happened, because I almost didn't make it entirely. My quick question is, that was great, thank you. I'd be interested in knowing how Robert Belknap, from whom I took a Russian literature course, made this possible.
Oh, because I thought he was a great teacher. He was my teacher for Humanities A.
He was.
Okay, and he was inspiring. That's all. Okay,
Thank you.
Dan, this
these
is
aren't all science teachers.
That's all he said. He's only inspiring.
Dan, this is 5 years later, an even more incredible presentation. And I hope that we have a link to a replay of it because it's beyond my poor power to.
Yeah, I don't know if they recorded
watch
that.
this. But I also hope, because we have a gaggle of grandchildren ranging from 21 down to 2, that one day I can sit down with them and explain to them how we can continue learning throughout our lives and give them an opportunity through this incredible presentation of yours to have a presentation on the brain that maybe I can't understand, but maybe my 2-year-old and 5-year-old, 7 and 11-year-olds who are sort of oriented to thinking in these terms, that they can grasp some of your fantastic wisdom. So I hope there's a replay link. Columbia, Ms. Moon, is there going to be a replay link?
Yes, we will. We have recorded the session and we will be posting it. So please keep an eye out. Apologies about all the technical issues.
Wonderful. So you can hear it again.
Great. Thank you.
I'm egotistical to think that people will listen to this for 5 years until our next reunion. Okay, and now it is time for.
Wait.
Not.
So not so fast, Gardner.
Well, you know, both Kai and I couldn't take science for poets. We were physics majors and we had to take serious physics. When I took one science course, it was right after the course for poets, the lab for that. And I looked longingly at the things they did in the poets lab because I thought those were really neat. And I wished we could have done it in our serious course for majors, but no. So that's why I gave this lecture tonight.
I remember that those steeply angled rows of seats in Pupine Hall where that Dan just referred to. So that's remarkably, that's my part of my long-term visual memory. So Neil's point about his grandchildren perhaps understanding better than he can what Dan said leads me to my second question that I can't let you go, Dan, without having your comment on. And that is that as you talked about, one of the daunting things about your talk was that as you talked about brains and the simplicity of the principles, what kept coursing through my head is, but that's very different from what I understand about computers. That, you know, the brain is not digital. It does have this, and doesn't kind of, it doesn't respond well to uncertainty, for example, to take one, you know, kind of a particular aspect of what you said. And the brain in particular doesn't seem to be at all like a computer in structure. And I wondered, is that true that it's also different in function? I don't want to get too deep,
it's
anyway.
different. It's different at an elementary level, but in fact, at the level of the circuits, we're finding more and more similarities. That is a whole other talk, okay? That would take, I don't know, it would take hours and hours. I can go on about that for hours and hours. And if you want, I can give a talk on that at our 60th reunion, which won't duplicate any of this stuff.
You should live so long.
Well, I hope so. But there are curious echoes. When the first computers were being designed in the late 1940s, in fact, the people who were doing it were thinking about the brain. And could they build a computing machine by thinking about the way we thought? Almost everything I have told you tonight was unknown in those days, but there's a certain resonance to the way they thought that actually continues to inspire us today. And there are lots of people in a field of computer science called neural networks, especially deep convolutional neural networks, that are looking to parallels between how the brain works. It falls apart at all sorts of levels. One is an imperfect model of the other, yet each can inspire the other. And everyone in systems or computational neuroscience thinks about this. But I'm not going to let you ask me any more questions.
No, that's fine.
Your time, it's your turn.
You went far enough into it.
We argued with each other for 8 years before, and his standard response was, "Oh, come off it, Gardner," and so I'm not going to let him do it anymore. It's all yours. I'm muting.
Okay. So I'm going to show you some pictures and talk over them. And after a while, I might even disappear from view. So as you see, I have adapted the title slightly, but we're actually going to talk about the same thing as was advertised. First, I want to welcome all of you to National Senior Health and Fitness Day, which is today. This is a reminder of how much our place in the world has changed in the 55 years since we sat together in front of Low Library, most of us anyway. I want to talk to you tonight about sustainability. This is a subject that has its technical features, certainly, and I'll dip slightly into those. But this is also a subject that all of us have opinions about. And so I want to stimulate and inform your opinions, unlike Dan, who is hosing us down with these this wonderful wonton soup model of the cell that I thought was quite entertaining, but also very provocative, that taught me things to think in a different way. And if I'm going to teach you to think about things in a different way, it'll be in a somewhat different approach. The subject of sustainability will be even more important to our children and grandchildren than it has been for us. And certainly one of the great surprises of my life has been the rise to prominence of environmental concern, something that I did not anticipate or imagine actually in college, let alone that the aspiration for a sustainable way of living would become an idea of global influence. Totally a surprise to someone, at least to me, in the class of 1966. Today, the pursuit of sustainability goes from the farmer's market and the national park to the Tesla showroom and the recycling bin, to most recently, the longing to be outdoors, to visible over the face masks that we see people wearing. Here's an image that'll surprise you. It's an image from the first Earth Day celebrated in 1970, when the masks were meant to ward off air pollution. And you see that this is it's remarkable how little has changed in the last 50 years. During the brief decades since we went to Morningside Heights, humanity has crossed momentous thresholds. Momentous, but for most of us, not much noticed, as we've passed lives that have been busy with family, with career, and the joys and travails of the world's privileged. Yet, as I will explain, in our lifetime, the Earth crossed into a new geological era. Much of what I have to say today is about unsustainability, as my title indicates. And then I'll try to say a few words about the search for a sustainable future. Unsustainability is a subject that is factual and quantitative, a description of shifting balances in the planet's accounts that human activities have been bringing about and continue to do. These shifts are mostly small, and in the 24-hour news cycle, they can seem quite slow. But they are not unimportant, not at all unimportant. The story of unsustainable activities is the story of global environmental change that is caused by people. This is the story of a new geological age, the Anthropocene, the epoch of humans. Anthro, like anthropology or misanthrope. The Anthropocene is of geological significance. For today, there is now forming a layer of rock that contains plastics and concrete and fragments of cell phones. It is rock from which the fossils of animals present just a century earlier, like the passenger pigeon, are missing. Still, there will be a lot of fossils in the Anthropocene rock, including perhaps some of the folks online this evening. Since we graduated from Columbia, the imprint of humanity on the planet has become unmistakable. One of the people who brought this to our attention was Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring was published in September 1962, as I was finding my way to Hamilton Hall in my contemporary civilization class. Carson's topic was one unknown in contemporary civilization. Her topic was the frailty of nature in the face of human industry and ingenuity. The title Silent Spring referred to the decline of songbirds poisoned by DDT and other pesticides. The book marks the beginning of today's environmental movement. But for now, I want you to think about the environment in terms of science rather than politics. I'll focus most of this talk on the way we are changing the climate. Climate change is much in the news today, but it is only one component of global environmental change. There is a lot more. Consider urbanization. Today, more than 8 of 10 Americans live in urban areas. But look back 55 years before our own graduation to 1911. At that time, about the time that our parents were born, fewer than half of the residents in this country lived in cities. In the time of my grandchildren, the oldest of whom is 11, the whole world has crossed the urban threshold. And today, a majority of humans live in cities. This is historically unprecedented. Our children are old enough to recall a different era. And as I will suggest, the transformation of humans into an urban species is a hopeful sign for sustainability. The era I'm calling the Anthropocene began 3 centuries ago in the Industrial Revolution. This is where today's climate change really got started. The world we live in has been refashioned by energy from fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas. The US economy consumes energy at the rate of 10,000 watts per person. A human being at rest generates 100 watts. I used to tease my students that they were about as bright as a light bulb. The US economy is running at the rate then of about 100 people per person. Very roughly, each of us has 99 slaves run by inanimate forms of energy that do our bidding, producing our food, powering our vehicles and devices, and running the infrastructures of water, gas stations, healthcare, government, and the rest of what we don't see, but nonetheless rely on. By the standards of the world that produced the books we read in humanities and contemporary civilization, we live in unimaginable luxury. That quest for prosperity is celebrated in this photograph by Mao Zedong, who is striding into the future, to the left, naturally enough for him, leading the plumes of smoke from China's factories. This luxury comes at a cost. The burning of fossil fuels produces carbon dioxide, the most important of the greenhouse gases. What does the word greenhouse mean here? Well, each of you owns one or more greenhouses. They're called automobiles. On a parking lot on a hot summer day, the sun shines in and the interior warms up while you're shopping. This is called the greenhouse effect. The addition of greenhouse gases to the planet's atmosphere is now warming the whole planet, altering the climate. We graduated in a time when the global average temperature was pretty stable. In our middle age, the planet began a rapid warming, about 1 degree centigrade since we were kids. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that the 20 warmest years in the historical record have all occurred since 1998, since my younger daughter graduated from high school. If you look over my children's lifetime, there were an average of 7 weather disasters per year in the United States, weather events that inflicted losses of more than $1 billion each, 7 per year. By last year, that 7 had grown to 22. This is what 1 degree centigrade means. A warming world includes warming seas and melting glaciers. The result is a rise in the worldwide sea level. By mid-century, it's estimated that 250 miles of the most important highways in Florida will be imperiled, with 4 times that mileage flooded in a major hurricane. This will take a lot of infrastructure funding to deal with. In coastal Asia, 300 million people will have to move by the end of the century, more than half in China, Bangladesh, and India, places that are already crowded. As the scholar David Victor wrote in the middle of May, we must get better at managing climate disasters as they become more numerous. Now, it's important to see that the harnessing of fossil fuels has brought benefits together with environmental change on a planetary scale. Since we graduated, the global economy has grown more than 4-fold, even more than the greenhouse gas emissions, which have only tripled. Energy brings benefits, no doubt of that. The problem is that the costs and risks are now rising. The scientific consensus is that we need to hold the total warming to about 2 degrees centigrade, and we're already more than halfway there. Projections based upon analyses of global energy use suggest that the 2-degree limit will be exceeded unless we make substantial changes somewhere between 2033 and 2047. That's why you hear so much talk in the political world about governmental commitments by 2030 and 2050. So those numbers those dates arise out of the scientific estimate of when we're going to break the speed limit and go into a climate world that none of us has seen or really can imagine figuring out how to manage. So the challenge looking forward is to shift from fossil fuels with their climate altering potential to other forms of energy. This is a very large challenge. One representative study does the projections by making a heroic assumption that the whole world will act together so as to minimize the economic costs of a transition to a clean energy economy. This gets all of our energy slaves rowing together toward the finish line of a stabilized climate. What would that look like? First, a stabilized climate can be reached within this century at an affordable economic cost, actually a rather small one. Second, the energy industry will look rather a lot like what we have today. Coal will have dwindled, as has been happening over the past decade already. Wind and solar will continue to increase, as they've been doing over the past 20 years. There will still be nuclear, hydropower, and even oil and gas, the latter accompanied by technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the exhaust. And there will be a lot more electricity in cars, particularly, but also in buildings. This is going to require a significant expansion of the national transmission grid, something few people thought about until last winter's storm in Texas. The point is that a clean energy system is already discernible, and most of us have grown used to the sight of windmills and acres of solar panels. This happy picture assumes an economically smooth transition. But of course, that is not at all what we see today. So the reality is very likely to be rougher in many ways. What we have today is sharp political polarization. Here are some data from the well-regarded Pew Research Center. Only about 1/3 of those who identify as or lean Republican think climate policies do more good than harm. So 2/3 of them are wary. Compare that to 3 out of 4 Democrats who favor climate policies. About 1 in 8 Democrats think climate policies harm the economy, so 7/8 do not, while more than half of Republicans fear the economic cost of clean energy. These divisions are sharper still in the Congress, the body that must make the policies that facilitate or gum up the transition to a clean energy economy. The Pew data were collected in 2019 during the Trump administration, which talked a bold game, but actually accomplished little on climate policy. The coal industry kept losing its markets while we heard about making America great again. We will see what can be done now, but the Biden proposals on climate cannot be pushed through in the face of unified Republican opposition in Congress. And of course, the world's energy economy cannot make a smooth transition while China continues to build coal plants and Saudi Arabia and Russia defend the market share of their oil and gas fields. The alignment of the world's powers that we studied in college was influenced to a significant degree by petroleum, particularly in the Middle East. After the Cold War ended, the rise of Vladimir Putin was underwritten by Russian oil and gas. In all this, climate change has been a minor concern. Will climate change, will those political circumstances change now that droughts and hurricanes, crop failures, and pandemic disease are loose upon the land? We shall see, along with our children and grandchildren. Let me turn now from the clear and present danger of climate change to a challenge that is no less threatening and unsustainable, but far less evident to most of us: the loss of biodiversity. The world is made up of ecosystems, communities of living things that grow and compete and eat one another. A bay is an ecosystem and also a farm field, just as much as a coral reef like this one in the Maldives, or a tropical forest. Humans have been farming and herding for about 10,000 years, seeking to shape ecosystems for human benefit. Today, fishing and logging are the only remaining forms of hunting and gathering that remain at commercial scale. All the rest is crops and pastures, greenhouses, and feedlots. As with fossil fuels, increasing human control has spawned unintended side effects. In clearing land, we altered vast ecosystems. The bison of the Great Plains are gone, replaced by wheat, corn, and soybeans, and subdivisions, offices, and shopping centers. So too with most of the whales and wild salmon, hunted to a small fraction of their abundances in the 19th century. All were highly visible members of far-flung ecosystems. But more important, the ecosystems they inhabited have been transformed. Ecosystems are localized. Their communities of plants and animals are bounded by what winemakers call terroir. Yet while individual ecosystems are local, the transformation of ecosystems has become a global phenomenon, a facet of the Anthropocene. That is why many different species are gone and will not leave fossils in our geological strata. We have over-harvested species we like to eat. We have re-engineered habitats by plowing and paving. We have thoughtlessly introduced unknown species into ecosystems with no natural predators until kudzu chokes southern forests and zebra mussels litter the beaches of the Great Lakes. And as Rachel Carson's book described, pesticides and other pollutants have unintentionally killed off birds. A study published in 2019 estimated that in North America, nearly a third of birds of all species have been lost in the time since we graduated from college, a quieter spring at least. And perhaps most sweepingly, we are changing the climate, driving the fish toward the poles as the oceans warm, shifting malaria, dengue, and other pathogens further north, and even making the cherry blossoms in Japan bloom more than a week earlier than they did while we were in school. The higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves into seawater, turning it more acidic. Oysters and other shellfish find it harder to make their shells in the more acid waters, a problem now faced by oyster farmers in the Pacific Northwest. All this means that we are undermining the ecosystems upon which all life depends. Because the changes are local for the most part, and because living communities can adjust to a very considerable degree, the damage is patchy, hard to see, hard to analyze. In the years to come, watch for changes in the incidence of malaria, which now kills about 1 million people a year, or about twice the rate that COVID-19 took from the American population in the past year. People are trying to limit the spread of malaria, of course, but a changing climate increases the range of the mosquitoes that carry it, and there is a seesaw battle going on. So this is something that I think we and our children will see evolving. More immediate is the rapid loss of tropical forests and coral reefs, the two most biologically significant kinds of wild ecosystems. Each is a tiny fraction of the Earth's area, but coral reefs nurture about a quarter of all marine species, and tropical forests harbor more than half of the species on land. Last year, despite the slowing of the economy due to the pandemic, the area of tropical forest loss was roughly the size of Switzerland. The destruction of the forest releases still more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. In 2020, about twice as much as all the cars in the United States. A similar erosion of the oceans is underway, and one credible estimate suggests that coral reefs may be gone by the end of this century, when our grandchildren will likely still be alive. Here is another momentous facet of the Anthropocene. The loss of biodiversity is less apparent than climate change. The outright loss of species is concentrated in poor countries in the tropics, and extinction is a hard thing to verify, even for highly visible, iconic species like whales. The ecosystems are the victims of people pursuing economic objectives. Where I live in Indiana, home builders got the legislature this year to scale back protection of wetlands so that more subdivisions can be built more cheaply. In a country with a housing shortage, that's a legitimate goal, but we do not notice the plants and animals driven out by the bulldozers. Eventually, of course, fisheries will disappear, as have the cod of the North Atlantic. Agricultural systems will decline, as we see already in the loss of honeybees, essential for pollinating flowering plants like fruit trees. There are still more silent springs to come. What can be done about global climate change, global environmental change? That is a sustainable relationship between humans and the natural world possible? Can the Anthropocene turn out to be a comedy? If the question is whether we can restore the pre-industrial separation between humans and the natural world, the answer is no. There are too many of us doing too much in material terms for that to be plausible, even if we had a way to bring back the dodo, the river dolphin, and the other species we have driven to extinction. Yet in the story of climate change, one can see a glimmer of hope. When you and I were in college, the ideas of energy efficiency and renewable energy resources were curiosities. Today, they are central to the business strategies of the energy industry. The innovations that brought this about have benefited from public investment in research and from facilitating policies in many levels of government. Bear in mind, though, that clean energy, sustainable energy, has risen to importance because it makes economic sense. That is why it is embraced by hard-nosed business executives, as well as hippies living off the grid, by the stock market, as well as the European Union. Indeed, hard-nosed business decisions are critical if clean energy is to achieve the scale, the Anthropocene planetary scale needed to stabilize the climate. And that is what is happening, slowly, too slowly so far, but it is happening. There is another glimmer of hope, as I mentioned earlier. Humans are moving into cities, and cities can be environmentally efficient. Consider New York, where the high density of human settlement makes mass transportation a necessity for most people. The consumption of energy in New York is concentrated in its buildings, where heating, cooling, and lighting account for a large fraction of the city's consumption of both energy and water. It's a good sign, then, that the nonprofit American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy ranks New York City first among US cities in its energy policies and programs, a legacy in part of Michael Bloomberg's time as mayor. I said there is a glimmer of hope. And if we've learned anything in the past 55 years, is that a hope is not a result. The climate story is far from over. That idealized analysis I quoted earlier projected that climate stabilization might happen about in 2080, when you and I will have joined the fossils in the Anthropocene geology. And there are divisions, all too apparent today, that need to be overcome so that our 100 slaves can be directed to the vast work that lies ahead. And the dwindling of biodiversity, that's a challenge we have yet to face for the most part. A poem I learned to cherish at Columbia is Tennyson's Ulysses. At the end, after reclaiming his throne and his wife, the wily old warrior reflects this way: old age hath yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. Seeking sustainability and forging it into workable solutions, that is work of noble note. I'd be happy to take some questions. And at the bottom, by the way, there are references for what I said. Just send me an email at the address at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be happy to send you back the information that I was drawing upon.
Thank you. Questions, please. I can begin. There's all of this controversy about the best way to cope with the carbon in the atmosphere. And where do you come off on the question of reducing generation versus the sequestration for the stuff that's already there?
Well, I think that where we are is that we need to do both. And we don't know about removing, we don't really know how to remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in a way that's economically feasible yet at the scales that would be required. And there are other ways, by the way, of doing what's called geoengineering. There are ideas about airplanes depositing sulfur dioxide in the upper atmosphere to screen the atmosphere like a gigantic parasol. There are ideas about putting up satellites that would literally erect parasols. So there's a number of those ideas that are out there. All of those are still in the future, and they are all very controversial, as you might imagine. The idea that a species that has done what we've done to the planet could now take the whole planet within its reach and do something responsible with it, that's something that a lot of people just don't believe, especially with the governments that we have and that we're dealing with. So I think that's going to be a hard thing to do. Reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide, as I said in the talk, is already going on and it's going on in big economies like China. And China and the United States are both increasing what's called the energy intensity of their economies. They're producing more and more economic benefit for less and less energy. That doesn't mean that they've reduced their carbon emissions yet, but they're slowing down like an airliner coming inside of an airfield. As you'll see, if you ask for the references, one book that I find very accessible and very helpful is Elizabeth Kolbert's new book, Under a White Sky. And she refers to, Elizabeth Kolbert is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who writes for the New Yorker. And so her writing is fluid and limpid and very easy to read. And what she does is to puzzle over the Anthropocene and what we are trying to do about it. And she recurrently comes up against this puzzle that you raised, Dan. Can a species like humans, which has done as much damage and transformation as we have, be entrusted with the task of taking on the still larger task of manipulating the whole environment? And she talks to a lot of people who say, that's what needs to be done now, so that we reverse all of we reduce some of the terrible things that we've done. And I think that there is some truth to that, but for better or worse, I will not be around. I'm certainly no longer an actor in the world where those decisions are made.
Sobering. Comments, questions?
Yeah, Kai, my impression is that progress on nuclear fusion is not sufficient and does not look like it's going to be sufficiently rapid to be of much help between now and the time when we need to achieve stabilization. And that ramping up of nuclear fission is going to have return of nuclear fission is going to have a much more prominent role if we're going to make progress going forward. Is that correct, or am I? Is that...
Well, I think that the first part of what you said about the relatively slow pace of fusion research is basically correct. I mean, that's been, you know, I'm not current on that progress in that field, but it's been really difficult. You know, it's a bit like harnessing a whirlwind. That you know, it's the technology to do that in a way which can be industrialized. It's turned out to be very, very difficult. Now, then you raise the question about nuclear fission, about the conventional kind of nuclear power, which does not, in and of itself, emit greenhouse gases. Although, like every other form of energy, creating the capital goods and fuel, that leads to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well. And it's so I think that fission, that is conventional nuclear power, conventional forms of nuclear power, may well play a role, but I don't yet see the interest in the business community and the electric utilities to embark upon buying what's available out there, which is very much like the behemoth-sized plants that got them into so much trouble in the 1970s and 80s. And I don't see yet much movement in the government to enable or incentivize that. And nuclear power was developed by the government initially. So how governments in general will pick this up. You know, the Chinese and the Russians are both trying to sell commercial nuclear power, and you know they face reputational difficulties, both of them. So that's why I think that there's that nuclear power looks today to be tough. Although, as you say, a lot of the technology is well understood already. We could ramp it up pretty quickly if there were the social and political will to do it. The big surprise to me, as someone who worked on energy policy for much of my career, the big surprise is the huge flowering of renewable energy. The price of solar generation has declined nearly 100-fold in the last 20 years. The price of wind power has declined 10-fold in the last decade. So those kinds of changes are the kinds of things we associate with computing in Silicon Valley. And that's partly because you know there's clever things that clever engineering tricks that make use of lessons from the electronics industry. Nonetheless, I think that you know the pace and scale has been breathtaking. And The Economist, in a fascinating article, actually in this week's issue, describes how green stocks, you know, environmentally responsible stocks in general, outperform the Standard & Poor's by almost 100% over the last year. Now, this looks and smells like a bubble to me, as it does to many observers. So I'm not trying to say that you should buy socially responsible stocks today, but The Economist does have, you know, makes a fascinating comment that like the dot-com bubble at the turn of the century, what might be happening now is a reconfiguring of the basic ingredients of the economy, so that even though a lot of companies went bust and the stock market went way down, the stock market went back up, driven by Silicon Valley stocks in the succeeding 20 years. Are we going to see something like that going forward? I think it's a little too early to say, but I do think that our children are going to find out, and that the good news might be that green energy and green energy has sort of led the pack. It's done even better than the rest of the environmentally responsible companies. That green energy might turn out to be a remarkable surprise. I'm not promising that, but I just say I was such a skeptic through most of my career that to hear it, that to see all this happening now, partly inspired by preparing this talk. Actually, you all led me to feel much more optimistic about this than I had dared hope.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're optimistic because, you know, what bothers me is you cite Tennyson's Ulysses, something that means more to us as we get older, but just a couple of lines away from the part that you quoted, he says something like, "'Tis not too late to seek either a better world or a newer world." And to me, that's a little worrying because it suggests we're going to have to find another planet somewhere.
Well,
So, it sounds like SpaceX. Come, it's not too late to seek a newer world.
well, you know, it's it's a tough proposition to lift people and the ecosystems they depend upon to Mars. You know, only to find a Chinese restaurant at the other end. I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't think that I think certainly space travel is being pursued, and that it will, you know, something like it will come to pass. Something like the science fiction projections will come to pass eventually. But 2030 is pretty close at hand, all right? It's 2021, we've got 9 years. I don't think even Elon Musk will have sold enough Teslas to fund the SpaceX that of his dreams by 2030, or even for that matter, 2050. So I do think that and I think that's why there was this undercurrent of tragedy in much of what I said, that it's already too late for so many of the species and ecosystems that we rely on. You know, what will happen to agriculture if we lose many more species of honeybees? And certainly the world that our grandchildren will experience will be very different and in some ways impoverished by our standards. But remember that our world is one that was impoverished by our parents and grandparents' standards as well. Okay, there's, you know, whether it's, you know, traditions or mores or how many people got divorced, or, you know, there's lots of things that we went through in our time that would have been regarded as social tragedies, the way that my wife and I now regard social media to be wreaking upon the world. So the lesson that I draw from that is change happens, and that my task is not to try to control my grandchildren want in their lives or what they choose to do. My task is to try to enable them to be good people. And, you know, it's quite remarkable to me that both Dan and I brought up both contemporary civilization and humanities in our talks. Maybe that's one of the things that binds us all together as members of the class of 1966. But those are also, you know, there was, while I remember precious little about from those courses, I do think that they shaped me in important ways. And I hope that my grandchildren will have that something similar that's what my education brought me. And good for you to remember Professor Belknap in your list of the shaping influences.
I was, as I said, impressed by him. I don't want to make the people from engineering who are also on this call unhappy that they didn't take the core, but at every reunion they get reminded of that. It's okay. You're still our classmates. More
So,
questions. More
Linda
comments.
Brownstein would like to ask Kylie a few questions.
Of course.
Please do.
Anyway, a privilege to listen to both you and
They
Dan,
did. Thank
Daniel
you.
Gardner. Anyway, I'm wondering if, and as you talk about the threats of the loss of biodiversity, you could talk about whether what kind of policies you think would have to be put in place to save the coral reefs and to save the declining species.
Well, okay, so two different answers to that. The decline of species is something we started acting upon in 1872 when Yellowstone Park was declared. That is, so that the basic strategy has been a kind of producing national parks at as large scale as we can imagine. So the largest marine national park, marine protected area, was declared northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. And it's far larger than any national park on land, and it's one of the largest ones at sea. And it was created by George W. Bush, not a person normally remembered as an environmentalist. So that is, that's one approach that people have been trying. And the task now is in the environmental community is a campaign called 30 by 30 to try to preserve 30% of the world's land and marine areas by 2030. It's an aspirational goal, is all I'll say about it. Now, if the climate is changing, what's happening is that the ecosystems are changing and under the species that live in them. And so parks with fixed boundaries are no longer the right way to think about this. And I think a lot of people are really puzzling over this because one thing we don't know how to do is to move with an ecosystem as it changes and moves. And all ecosystems change. That, as Dan was talking about the complexities of the brain, I was thinking about ecosystems and how they too are very dynamic, and there are all kinds of different memory and learning mechanisms in them. So I think we are struggling with that. With some of the introduced species now, like cane toads in Australia or kudzu in the American South, there are people who are trying to use advanced technologies to deal with them. So today I was just listening to a news broadcast about, actually there's another article in The Economist about companies that are now using messenger RNA, the stuff that's in the vaccines that we've all hopefully had, to spray onto plants so as to eliminate the pests that infest them by targeting the metabolisms of the pests, infecting them not with a living thing like a virus, but with chemicals that will interrupt their cellular processes. So there is that kind of high-tech aspect of this that's just really getting started in conservation, and some of the work that I'm still involved in is about trying to bring the latest genomic advances into conservation practice. So there's a lot going on, but it's all just very early stage. I mean, think about solar power in 1970. We're sort of at that stage, and we don't have the kind of economic heft behind it yet that propelled solar power to where it is today. So Linda, I wish I could say the prospect is good. I'm afraid it isn't. And it's something that I looked for inspiration to my students when I was teaching, many of whom embraced biodiversity conservation as a cause to which they were cheerfully committing their lives. They were awfully smart people, and smart people do great things, but whether they will have enough time and enough space, they will certainly reshape the Anthropocene from what it was going to be like when I graduated from college. There's no question of that. But whether that will be sufficient by some standard, I don't have an answer to that.
Kylie, you're terrific. Maybe we could get you to also come back to do a fireside chat at Yosemite National Institute's now called Nature Bridge.
Yes, yes.
This would be right up the alley for the.
Well, Neil, before you were involved with the Yosemite National Institute as it was then, I was on the board of directors.
Yes, I'm well aware. I was chair of the board for 7 years,
Yes.
and we coveted the possibility every year that you might come back. Anyway.
Well, invitation accepted.
Well, I will
figure out a way to make
follow
this
through with that. I will follow through with that.
Yeah. Great.
If you will arrange a room at the Awani, I'll be glad to come and address the group.
Dan, I will call
Either room
I'll call my
440.
Zoom breakout room Awani.
No. Either room 444 or 450. We'll.
And Dan, if you arrange for the right room at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital or at the Cornell Hospital, I might make it to the 60th reunion.
Yeah, well, luckily, all of our doctors at both branches of the hospital actually are pretty good. I'm proud to be associated with, the University Hospital of both Columbia and Cornell. So there's a possibility for all of us. Gaby, I sent you a
can't tell you the
private message you
number.
haven't responded to, in the chat. So
I
this
saw
was-
that, but I don't recognize him.
oh, you
from
don't
my-
recognize her name? No? Okay.
From his,
So
oh,
the-
Stanley. I thought you said.
yeah, I'd like to remind members of 66 of both the college and of SEAS that we have some talks coming up. In particular, next week, next Thursday, there's going to be a talk by Ira Katz-Nelson on serving as the provost of Columbia. And on Friday, the 4th, is an unstructured event. And indeed, let's see, tomorrow, the 27th, there's a trial of the Chicago 7 talkback, which also involves members of the class of 66. So this is a prolonged reunion, which is very good. So I'd like to thank all of you dedicated alumni for showing up tonight, and Kai as well for giving us this sobering talk in which the best we can hope for is apparently uncertainty, because that does lead.
And thank you for the talk that told us how we deal with uncertainty.
Well, it does. I mean, everything we heard tonight, we heard because of our brains. It was filtered by the few little things that the specialist neurons know to do. And I hope that's a good note to end on. Thank you all, and I hope you see you all at the next Columbia event.
Thank you both.
Thank
It was
you
really,
both
really
very much.
Appreciate it.
Wonderful.
And
Really
GA,
good.
thanks very much for your support. That was-
Roar Lions roar.
Thank you.
Good night.
Kai, it's very good to see you again. Thank you.
Great to see you.